stories of the pages of our history textbooks lack credibility, but out of them all, the story of Genghis Khan seems to be a crown jewel of all unbelievable fictions. Huge swarms of Mongolian warriors stormed into Europe, conquered everything, including Asia on the way, and reached all the way to Egypt. The History Channel documentaries assure us. But in the specialized literature for historians only, we read about a completely different story. So in the specialized literature, they admit, well, of course, there were a couple of Mongolians in the army. The majority were Russian Tatars, but it is called the Mongolian army. Well, of course, how can you have huge black swarms of Mongolian warriors if you never had any swarms of any type of people in Mongolia ever? It is so scarcely populated. It's deserty. Even if we assume that they mobilized all their women, children and camels, still it could never account for those swarms shown on the History Channel documentaries.
Just 2 centuries ago, its entire population was barely 500,000 people. According to mainstream sources, in Genghis Khan's time, Mongolia's population was a couple of thousand people, most of which, of course, were women and children. And by the way, the Mongolians are the most peaceful nation on earth you can imagine. They still lead nomadic lives, as they used to do centuries ago. And the idea that they could have mobilized an army, any reasonable army, out of these couple thousand people is quite disconnected from reality. Because the men are very few. And the ones that are around are needed to always assemble and disassemble their tents. Because they are a nomadic people. They constantly move, following their cattle. And they move their tents as well. In addition, in terms of natural resources, Mongolia is deprived of metals and doesn't have any record, or any tradition at all, in terms of the making of metal weaponry.
That is why that story is presented in the professional historians' literature, that the army was of foreigners and there were just a couple of Mongolians on the top. And how did this couple of Mongolians convince the most mighty Chinese and Russian armies to become their subservients? Well, to that question, the so-called historians just don't give any answer, skip it, and it is left to us to wonder how did they do it. Well, I came up only with 2 ideas. First of all, maybe the couple of Mongolians on the top took over the enemy's armies by scaring them with a procession of paper dragons. Another scenario that I would suggest for inclusion in those mainstream history books is that the traditional Mongolian fighters, like the ones you see on the photo, they organized a rainbow parade for the Russian and Chinese armies, and when the other side saw them, they decided, "We are your slaves forever." Maybe you didn't find my 2 suggestions very convincing, but my endeavor was to maintain the general level of credibility of the rest of the stories that they're giving us. Like, for example, the Mongolian fighters, why they could conquer 2-3 continents, is that they could appear out of nowhere and disappear, evaporate. So are they telling us that he had some sort of shamans in his army that were making people visible, invisible, or something like that? Indeed, there were and still there are martial arts in those parts of Asia that would seem truly magical to us. But that was spread all over the region, not just in Mongolia. And indeed, now these martial arts are present in higher, more developed levels exactly in the areas that were supposedly conquered by Genghis Khan, not Mongolia. And there is zero evidence suggesting that it was any different in those times. Here, the renowned cartographer Abraham Ortelius is showing us what people meant when they said Mongols and Mongols in the past. They were people part of Tartaria, and they are clearly depicted as being blonde. They lived in Siberia. Let's have a look at the actual historic sources. Maybe they will give us a clue who invaded Europe and Asia and how did they do it. This full story of some Mongolians taking over 2-3 continents, reaching even Africa, started to appear on the pages of the history books sometime in the 18th century. Before that, the historians didn't know anything about it. And this is how the story emerged. In year 1826, the Russian Academy of Sciences, which by the way is a foreign entity, offered a very substantial financial grant for any local or foreign historian who would compile a story of Mongolian invasion of Russia and Europe. That's how the idea appeared for the first time. They had a strict requirement that the works must be submitted within 3 years. Interestingly enough, 6 years later, they came up with the very same offer again. Well, they did have a single response, a work submitted from Germany, but it was not approved. And by the way, till date, specialists in Oriental studies say that although many have tried to really delve deep into the matter, till date there is not a single comprehensive published research on this so-called invasion in either scientific or even in the form of popular literature. And still, it is accepted as history by the academia. Usually they would quote two authentic sources. One of them is an 18th century book called The Secret History of the Mongols. Even prominent mainstream Oriental historians doubt the validity of this source, and full reference can be found in the new chronology books of Anatoly Fomenko, to which I have provided links already many times. And the second source, quoted as pure and authentic, is the work of the Arabic historian Rashed ad-Din. Of course, a copy of the Golden Book miraculously emerged in St. Petersburg exactly when needed for compiling this new history. But of course, the validity of every historic document can be questioned. But what is the most disturbing here is that the first translator Berezin openly admits that he was pressured and forced to insert names and geographical coordinates in his translation according to his knowledge. What does it mean according to his knowledge? The translator explains In many occasions, the diacritic marks were missing. Those are the pronunciation marks of how the names are pronounced. And in many cases, yet the very names were missing altogether. And the translator was forced to add them according to his knowledge. What does it mean according to his knowledge if the book he is translating is actually the only alleged source of any knowledge on this matter to start with? So if this entire story of the Mongolian invasion of Europe and Asia was basically a sponsored idea which emerged a couple of 100 years ago, then what did people believe in before that? Do we have any contemporary records of some sort of invasion of that time?
For example, a certain person called Julian, a Hungarian missionary and witness of this invasion, describes the invaders as Tartars, that were a blonde, Gothic people.
They came from Gothia, Tartaria.
Now, this could be confusing for those who haven't read yet the books of the New Chronology by Anatoly Fomenko, where numerous quotes are given, proving that in older times, when people say Goths, they actually meant the Slavic people. And the modern idea that these are just people of Germanic origin doesn't quite do the Goth idea justice. This division was artificially created at a time when the nations that mixed with the survivors and were spreading their survivor culture, their true history, needed to be blurred. And that is why at different locations they were given different names. And nowadays people think that these were altogether different people, while reality was different.
People who have a Gothic heritage in modern terms may have the feeling that I wanna rob them of their glorious history by saying that the Goths were actually Slavic people. If that's the case, you may turn it the other way around and take it to mean that the Slavic people were Goths, if that sounds better. Here, on the old map, the truth transpires. Gothia is in Tartaria. Slavic and Gothic people were one and the same. Actually, it's a couple of places that are called Gothia on this very same map, and all of them are on the shore of the Black Sea. One is on the northwest shore, and the other one is straightforward north from the Black Sea. Nowadays, the people of those areas are called Slavic. They're not called Goths. And all this confusion with the names was created only on purpose to blur the truth about the true origin of the various nations. But regardless what name we put on the invaders, one thing is for sure, all the contemporary writers, without exception, describe them as Caucasian people, very often blonde. Which again is not disputed by the specialized mainstream historic literature. They just add that thing, yes, the army was Caucasian, but the chief was Mongolian. These are some contemporary drawings, art, illustrating what people meant in those days when they say Tartars. Here, visitors from Western Europe depict what they saw when they visited the court of the Tartar prince and princess. And this is how medieval people believed Genghis Khan looks before the introduction of the new fabricated history. Marco Polo visited the direct descendants, the sons of Genghis Khan, and this is an illustration made by his contemporaries upon his return after he published his accounts of what he saw. Here Marco Polo is being welcomed by the great Mongol, the Tartar king. But when they print this same book in modern times, this is the type of illustrations that they put. This depicts the very same scene. Another modern illustration, the Great Khan, looks completely different from what Marco Polo speaks about in his book. This is how it looked in the original illustrations. Now this is an old drawing of another Mongol ruler. Very interesting how he looks when Western European artists paint him. Now that's what you see on the right side. What did it mean actually Tartars at the time, medieval times, when contemporaries were describing the invaders as Tatars or Tartars? Nowadays, a very small and relatively unimportant province of Russia is called Tatarstan, but as we saw in the previous episode, in the past, the full region, even much bigger than Russia, even including parts of Eastern Europe, was called Tartaria. This was the name by which the country was known in the Western circles. The people that lived there themselves would identify themselves in a different fashion. The residents of what we call nowadays Mongolia were definitely some of the Tartars, because they were always part of Great Tartaria, but they were not particularly influential. That's why they are very rarely mentioned on any medieval maps, and indeed, because we see Mongols all over the place in Tartaria, usually it is somewhere else, and not the Mongols word is somewhere else in the area influenced by the survivors, and not where Mongolia is nowadays. In this particular map, Mongol is placed in Siberia and not in Mongolia. Let's not forget what the medieval texts tell us. The Tartars were Goths. For example, on this old map, we see Tartars all over in Eastern Europe, in what it is nowadays Bulgaria, Romania, all these countries. Even as close as a couple of centuries ago, these Slavic nations were still part of this bigger federation, which was still honoring the principles of the culture of the nature people, the survivors, or the scattered people, as Mavro Urbini called them. Now, some of you may object, but all these Eastern European countries, they had their own kings at that time, and there are documents about it, isn't it? That is partially true. But when the team of the new chronology examined the actual dynasties of all these Slavic kings, ancient Bulgarians, Dacians, and so on, It transpires that these dynasties, in many cases, not all, sometimes there were local rulers as well, especially in more recent times. They are duplicates of the Khans that were the Khans of Tartary, that huge federation that was honoring the rules of the survivors and their culture. What does it mean that they were recognized as phantom duplicates? Well, charts are made with the names of all kings, and other details are included, like the duration of their rule, also main events that happened, personal details about their families and wives, and so on. And that is done for both sets of dynasties. And this is a sample of how the resulting charts look like. And when we notice that full dynasties, the names of the kings, the years of their reign, their achievements, the actual wars, when we see that they match very, very closely, it is really a very good chance that we have a case of actual phantom dynasty. And the need of such phantom dynasties arose when this federation of Great Tartaria was removed from history. Then they had to fill up the gaps with something. And because it would have been harder to convince people that it was crocodiles from the constellation of Andromeda that were ruling the earth at that time, they had to make some sort of mixture of semi-truth and fiction that would be believable to people. And that's how these phantom dynasties appeared. That was much easier because anyway the names were pronounced differently in all countries, the name of a very same person. So the main trick was that, oh, these were different kings, this was your local king, it wasn't the head of the federation, while actually in the history records it would be something else, but that's how they twisted it.
For example, the Lithuanian and Polish Tartars, they took part in the army of Napoleon, and that's why some artifacts from them were saved. This was their hat, and this was their symbol. It looks somewhat Muslim, but in reality, as we know from earlier episodes, the crescent sign was one of the symbols of this vast federation of nations that supported the survivors' culture. In many cases, if one visited the traditional Orthodox churches in Eastern Europe and listens when the priests read from the old texts, he or she will hear something like
Boga Nasheva, which means our Lord.
which is a simple and straightforward Russian language. The time when all Slavic people belonged to a single federation was not at all far away in the past, but it looks like this because all the common elements of their culture, although they are absolutely the same, bear different names in each country, according to mainstream history.
Genghis Khan, who conquered a couple of continents and created the biggest empire ever, as mainstream history assures us, was a Mongol himself. What does that mean? Did he come from nowadays Mongolia? Actually, Mongolia acquired the status of an independent country for the first time in the 20th century. Earlier cartographers did not feel the need to mention Mongols, any Mongols where nowadays Mongolia is. They would usually place them in two places in Siberia, this map being just one example out of the countless. Two places with Mongols in Siberia and none in current Mongolia. Only at the later stages in 17th and 18th century we start seeing some sort of Mugalia or Mugalia on the maps, which later on evolved into Mongolia. So the people of nowadays Mongolia are just one out of the many descendants of nations that called themselves Mongols. For example, this map is from the times when nowadays Mongolia was just emerging as a separate entity. That's why we see both Mugalia and Mongols on the same map, the Great Mongol Empire as well. Countless old drawings and paintings depict the Mongols as clearly Caucasian people with turbans on their heads. For example, this is what the ambassador in Moscow from Western Europe saw on his reception upon arrival in Russia. These are the contemporary old illustrations of this book. And just a remark for those of you who like to read the Bible, some of the areas, because there are 4 or 5 general areas on the old maps that appear with name Mongol, 2 of them are in Siberia and one of them gradually transforms into the kingdom of Gog and Magog. And here some old Bible original text. It says with Cyrillic letters, this is not a translation, Magoga Knyaza Ruska. So it turns out that the allegedly mystical kingdom, biblical kingdom of Gog and Magog is nothing else but the Siberian parts of the Knyaza Ruska, the kingdom of the Rasseyanami. Ruska comes from Rasseyanami, the scattered people, as Mavro Urbini called them. So again, this very common trick has been used, unnecessary mystification. Oh, nobody knows where is Gog and Magog, it's biblical, it's lost. No, it's not. They are telling us that the location is unknown just because they don't want us to hear about the Great Tartaria, which is the great empire of the Mongols. And by the way, those Mongols that invaded, took over Europe and Asia, were the same people that we call Mongols or Moguls nowadays. They were not Mongolians. The Mongolians were a small and not very significant part of the Mogul culture. They were not all the Moguls or Mughals. And actually, honestly, looking at the older maps, there are many Mongol places, but usually India is the one that comes with the biggest letters and it's the most frequent one. It says with the big letters. Magna Mongol, the great empire of the Mongols. Although various alternative forms are used nowadays, like Mughal, even Mongol in its pure form is still used till date. It doesn't mean that the Indians are Mongolians, though. Actually, till date, Mongol means a rich, influential person. Any person of any race, not necessarily Mongolian. This is, for example, how the Mongol warriors would look like, and this is what the modern so-called historians are trying to convince us they looked like, and this is a so-called restoration of an old painting. Very professionally they restored it indeed. And it is not by chance that India is a favorite for those who seek genuine spirituality. It is there where the people manage to organize themselves and write down the Vedic literature, which contains direct instructions from the old civilizations with relatively little editing. And because through the ages they remained again only relatively loyal to the angelic principles on which the Vedic books are based. And by the way, speaking of India, the famous Taj Mahal is an excellent example and evidence of the times when Islam and the Hindu faith, so to say, were one and the same. Usually, Taj Mahal is considered a Muslim building. And yet, below the layers of restoration, at many places, Hindu symbols and elements surface. And because most people in India are brainwashed with the new fraudulent history, what is the result of these findings of both Hindu and Muslim layers in Taj Mahal? The result is that it further fires this religious intolerance. People quarrel, oh, it's ours, no, it's ours. They fight, they kill each other because of that. And not only Islam and Hinduism are branches growing from the same trunk, from the tree with the same root. This is applicable to all religions. They started branching out when spirituality became so blurred that the need of organized religion arose. Christianity is yet another branch of that very same tree. Look at this old image of Kremlin. The style of dressing and the interior is purely Mongol, Mughal, whatever you want to call it. And not only all men were wearing the same turbans on their heads. Pay attention to what the Indian mademoiselles wear on their heads. They wear crowns of style that is identical to that of the Tartary princesses. The Indians kept carefully for us not only the literature of the survivors but also their outfits. This is what the ladies wear in India on the street even nowadays. These are Indian fashion shows, and these are fashion shows from the West where the advanced people live. So the penguins assure us that not only Genghis Khan conquered half of the world, but his dynasty ruled over the majority of the conquered territories for entire 300 years. That yoke only ended, continue the historians, in 15th century. Sounds like a grand empire to me. Has it left any artifacts or writings of some sort? Well, not really, no artifacts, but the historians have come up with writings, and indeed they have found one stone that appears to have Mongolian signs on it. They also say that the Persian novel is actually Mongolian. It was never studied before as Mongolian because it looks Persian, and they themselves continue. It is actually in Tartar language, they say, but the signs must be Mongolian. Well, how convincing. Two other pieces of writing have suddenly emerged in European private libraries. And if we believe a translator called Schmidt, they must be Mongolian, although the writing of the two documents differs, and it differs from the stone as well. And in addition, they have been found under suspicious circumstances. But if Schmidt says, then we can build the world history upon his honest word. The image, by the way, again we have Marco Polo visiting the great Mongolian Khan. To make it look Mongolian, the so-called historians, they just can't are ready to tell anything. Like, these scripts were not studied before, because if you look at them, they look like Turkish. And also the descendants of the Mongols, according to that novel that they are talking about, are actually Turkish people. Very strange that the Turks are not aware that they are actually Mongolians. My cat suffers from the same problem. He thinks he's actually a lion. But luckily we have historians in penguin suits who are here to tell us who are we, and so we cannot make mistakes like the cat or like the Turks, who actually think they're Turks but they're actually Mongolians. So those few signs on the stone and the other writings that we must believe are Mongolian somehow, though they don't match, is all we have left of this empire that ruled for hundreds of years. Strange.
Do you remember the Arabic Chronicle, where the translator was forced to add names and locations according to his knowledge? Well, that is very often quoted by mainstream historians. But strange that they only quote some parts of it, the ones that were maybe later on added. And they don't like to quote other parts. For example, the ones that describe the appearance of Genghis Khan as a blond man with blue eyes. Other historic records describe his sons in the same way. Well, the old images are not included in the history books, they say. And this is how the new Genghis Khan looks like. But if indeed the Mongolian army was plundering for hundreds of years vast territories of the world, it must have had some artifacts from all the plundering, or some sort of capital, or any sophisticated culture, anything at all. No, it's just zero. It's not there. I mean, the Mongolians are very simple shepherds, and in recent years, when more and more of them became literate, to their great surprise, they learned from the Westerners that they had been ruling the world at one point. They had no clue about it before that. Yeah, all those monuments of Genghis Khan in Mongolia were erected after they heard about it from the West, about their history. They don't have any legend stating that they have ever ruled anything, actually. Yes, they did have great Khans, but those were the Khans of Tartaria that they were always a part of. As far as any of the Mongolian tribes ruling continents, that is just non-existent in their history or traditions.
The main task of every good mainstream historian is just copy and paste. But there are exceptions, and Eric Middleford is one of them. He used to work in various European historical archives, and actually he started reading the old books. He noticed very strange ideas spreading amongst the nobles and clergy of Europe in the 16th century. He found numerous unrelated records that in various parts of Europe, men of high position were trembling with fear and suffering from severe paranoia that tomorrow the Tartars and Mongols are invading again. How is that possible if those were really from Mongolia and some century before that they already lost their strength and were no longer holding Asia? How could they arrive in Europe tomorrow by flight or? Middleford really found out a lot of genuine records of otherwise absolutely sane people suffering from this very strange paranoia, even to the point that one, for example, was sleeping with full body military armor at night out of fear that the Mongols may knock on his window. Middleford decided that they must have suffered from some extremely weird mental disease, and these ideas were even contagious and also infecting only noble people and clergy. Well, his hypothesis is not less weird than the virus that infected the nobles, but in the light of the new chronology history, all this fits perfectly very well, because in the 16th century, still the Tartars and Mongols were there where they have always been in Tartaria. It is absolutely possible that there were rumors at that time that the Tartars were planning to conquer Europe again. Please note that I am narrating these historical events not because I approve them or I endorse the very idea of some big empire, just on the contrary. The full point of the Survivor series is to point out how normal people were gradually tricked into empires, countries, and other limitations just to lose their freedom. Once we become aware in what kind of trap have we fallen, then we'll know how to get out of it. Let's now see how the modern fairy tale myth about Genghis Khan of Mongolia is perpetuated in the modern society with the help of mass media. Spicy articles assure us that scientists have found out that 0.5% of the full population of Earth now are descendants of Genghis Khan, and colorful diagrams are added that nobody understands so that it makes it look scientific. It is soon even turned into some sort of business and show, and you can even spend money to test yourself if you're descendant of Genghis Khan. Here and there, a few voices calling for sanity are writing articles that this is impossible, but when the monster big media, the mass media, supports it with spicy titles, we owe it all to the superstud Genghis Khan, people believe that's real science. Some people still can think for themselves, and when they read this, they did the math of how many children he must have made and so on, and still it's impossible. He wouldn't have had time to do all this 24-hour procreational job. When did he sleep? When did he eat or go to war? And those who started the misinformation campaign at the first place thought about this, and that's why they cleverly said, well, he didn't do it all by himself, it was his sons who did most of the hard work. It's not that his numerous sons did most of the work, so to say, because if they were born to raped women, they would be bastards, meaning the parents don't live together, and that means that they would have automatically less chances of having lots of progeny in the society where they live. They will have unequal chances for having children. Only his legitimate sons, who will be negligibly small number compared to percentages of the world's population, only they will have the opportunity to have more children than average. And actually, as these spicy articles in the newspapers admit themselves somewhere towards the end with small letters, all this is based on a hypothesis and interpretation by certain scientists, not all of them agree, that a certain group maybe has this particular given pattern in their DNA code because they had a common man in their ancestry. Even that is not sure. And even if we assume that all these people who belong to this group indeed had a common forefather long time ago, hundreds of years ago, how would we know it's exactly Genghis Khan? They have never even found his capital, what to speak of mummy or anything else, but they know that all the children are from him only. All this is very depictive of how the newspaper articles, and especially their titles with big letters, can really create very wrong impressions in people about their true history. In this case, all this full story of Genghis Khan seems to be reinforced and confirmed by the DNA study, while in reality, the DNA so-called study is actually based on this fiction. The story is also very depictive of how the so-called DNA science can easily become one of the strong pillars of what I call the TV religion, means believe everything that TV tells you, for the simple reason that they can just tell any nonsense and then say, oh, it is a result of scientific research, and they are not obliged to provide the base data of this research, or even if they have to, it's so easy to manufacture. Just take a computer and type any string of anything you want. And for those of you who still may doubt that Genghis Khan has anything to do with Mongolia specifically, They may wonder, well, but he's mentioned in so many foreign chronicles. We see quotes of on the internet. You will find this is a depiction of Genghis Khan in Japanese chronicle, in mm, Chinese chronicle. What about those? Well, Genghis Khan is not a proper personal name. It means the great Khan. So this makes it very convenient to match any Khan, any ruler you wish, to him. It is so easy because most rulers are described, at least in one place, as great. Actually, if you decide to spend some time in a serious study, you will find out that the mainstream historians even have no clue what was the name of Genghis Khan in Mongolian at the time he was supposedly ruling it. It is that much a lack of any information about him in Mongolia itself. The way they give it written and pronounced in Mongolian language, that is in modern Mongolian language. Uh, at his time, in his epoch, completely different language was used, as they themselves admit, and they have no clue. I mean, they have different versions, but it is not even clear what was his name at that time. Somebody complained that I'm trying to deprive the poor Mongolians of their national pride. But if Genghis Khan was indeed, as he is portrayed by the mainstream sources, plunderer, aggressive invader, then should anybody of real noble nature be proud to have a man of such quality in his ancestry? But since the mainstream history is one big joke, we don't even know what kind of qualities he had, and was he really an invader, or was he just reclaiming lands, which anyway originally belonged to Tartaria. But that's a completely different subject. We're just in the dawn of discovering that Tartaria existed. We don't know much details of its history and wars. But the Mongolians indeed have something which they can be really proud of, and that is that they are one of the most peaceful nations on earth. They did not buy into parasitic propaganda for going to wars, participating in wars. And also, they managed to preserve this amazing traditional music, the Mongolian throat singing, which is like a time capsule from the times when those who survived from the old advanced civilizations were educating the simple tribal people of the earth. Yes, indeed, the Mongolians do have good reason to be very proud of their heritage.